What in hell is that supposed to be? Utid was drunk. Very drunk, and had just taken a piss at the back of the Two Cranes Inn, the passing of which had been disturbed by his loyal friend breaking into a drunken song. Looking over, Finan grinned, and hummed the refrain once more. They were back. Having forced a retreat on Irrikind and Siegfried Thurgilson, demanding Guthar's Cumbraland army to do so, allowed Ragnar revenge on Kjartan and Sven, liberating Thyra and keeping Dunham. It had been difficult for Utid to leave Northumbria without first avenging his uncle and reclaiming Bibbenburg. Finan knew this, and that returning to Wessex was a wrench so annoying Utid meant that he kept his friend focused. Oran, he called back, as if that explained everything. Finan was more than a little drunk himself. In. He pronounced the syllables slowly, which should make Utid understand them instantly. Ireland's song. Yerajit, he added, clapping the now retrousered Utid on the shoulder. You're in a good mood, Utid replied, as they stumbled back towards the pub doorway. And why would I not be? I'm at liberty, he emphasized, to fight next to you, Utid. I have food, shelter. He pushed on the oak door, stepping slightly unsteadily towards Clarpa and Citric, ale. He cheered as Utid's men matched Finan's toast to the watered-down drink in the mostly inn. And to Utid. Finan turned to him, grabbing up his tankard. Health, wealth, and to your continued favor with Alfred. If it lasts, Utid replied, raising up his tankard anyway. Gisela likes cookum, my children are safe, we are prosperous. Ethelfled is due to marry. Edward is growing strong. The king is as happy to have me as his warrior as I am to have his patronage. Yeah, agreed his men, all four of them raising up their tankards. If it lasts, Utid added, quietly, to Finan. Why wouldn't it? Silver from your Danish father Ragnar fell into his hand by the conduit of the most blessed Hildegith. He won twice, silver, and you. And he risks little in all of that by sending your brother Ragnar. Do you not consider it? Utid stared at Finan. I consider it daily. It is to my benefit too. Gisela is safe. Finan nodded. An agreement that suited them both. And Irian? He looked at Finan meaningfully. My own edged head. Finan shot back, remembering a better time. Yes? There weren't many. Utid was about to press his friend more, but Finan put his tankard to his lips pointedly, sipping deeply. When he put it onto the board, their warrior, lately slave, clarified nothing. Behind them, a young man in a monk's habit looked on, and further on, making to get up, his mind fixing on his uncle's words about the mighty warrior he called Erseling. But his nerve faltered, in the end. Behind him, a girl working her trade, the oldest one in the world, twinkled at Citric before being hustled back away into an adjoining room, a curtain falling across the doorway by the irate landlord, who glowered in their direction. And her name's? Finan Promote. Citric flashed his eyes towards him, and blinked, as if being awoken from thinking faraway thoughts. The girl. Finan prompted. Leave him be, she's just a tavern whore, dismissed Utid, as Clarpa replenished their ale. Elfberg, Citric looked back at Finan. Utid banged his pot onto the boards of their table as Clarpa topped up its contents from the jug he had bought, and tutted. Come on, Utid, Finan chided mildly, you said yourself. You cannot choose who the gods gives you to love. Look at Father Boka and Thyra. Thyra is no whore. Utid shot back, starting forward. Finan said nothing, waiting for his friend to work out that he hadn't said that at all. Utid looked at Citric, and shook his head, but said nothing. Then Clarpa began to speak, holding out his ale pot. The raven flies into a tree, and bravely though the warrior be, he looks at that grave omen come, joined in Citric, to the tune that Clarpa was struggling to find, and forces legs still which would run, added Finan, until they were all singing the pre-Christian Saxon folk song. And away across the battlefield, flies sword and axe and spear and shield. The good spirit Osrith felt a week before, knowing her brother was near and she had but to reach him, had all but evaporated as poor fortune followed after poor fortune. It was a mere 10 miles north to Winton so as to buy the Roman road. She had been assured by a dock trader who she had seen buying from Gert at the quay, but when she had inquired into means of transport, nothing seemed forthcoming. It didn't help that her speech was different compared to the English Osrith spoke and, after proffering a small sum to one textile merchant, who drove off with the silver but not Osrith, she set to walk to Wessex's capital. Silver was fast falling through her fingers as Osrith moved from tavern to tavern, living on the food for sale in the insalubrious institutions. She could not see another way to live in the city, until she was down to her last 2 coins. She had also hoped, in a vague way, that the taverns would be places where she may hear of her brother. But no one spoke of him, and when she went to church, to listen for a priest called vicar, she heard nothing either. One night, a month after being in Winchester, Osrith decided that her means were outstripping her ambition of finding Uhtred. She had enough for food for the next few days, but not enough for board. The nights were mild enough to sleep outside, wrapped in her woolen cloak, and she found a lee not far from the river, which would do while she contemplated what to do. Because what she had been doing at the moment was a waste of time and money. Closing her eyes that night, Osrith contemplated her options. Returning to Alba and to King Domnall was out of the question, for it was acceding to his will, and his will was a marriage to benefit his crown. Even now, knowing that, Osrith still could not hate him. Oh, she had tried to hate Domnall mac Corstin Alpin but, Osrith found, she could not. He was a king in the true sense, gaining power to lead his people. He had brought the idea of kingship to Alba through the Irish High Kings, literally, with the red sandstone block that he had placed at the meeting of the 3 kingdoms of Pitland, Strathclyde, and Dalriada, extending the idea of king and god from Dun to the whole of the northern lands and, like Comsil had conferred godliness on the kingship of his ancestors, the Bishop of Iona had continued this at Scone. And to do this, like kings before him, he had to make harsh choices. No, Osrith could not hate a man she admired. Had he not, Finolai would not have been awaiting the slaver, and Osrith might not have had a chance to help him escape had he, in turn, not helped her. But there was another reason, one deeper in her heart, and one she knew she must get over quickly, tagged. Even now, in the black of the night, Osrith could see his face, determined and bold, crusting a soft creativity. Everyone listened when Tagged of Doia began to sing, or to tell a tale. It drew you in. You became part of that song or that story as long as the storyteller did not stop. And, on long, winter nights, the storyteller might have been telling stories for most of the night. But it was behind her. She had to pack up those feelings and never think of Alba, harden her heart, as she had done against Bibbenberg, her uncle, her once home. Just dash. A click in the blackness flicked Osrith's mind to her place in amongst the sheltered trees. Was there something there? Someone? She waited, watching. When nothing more came, she settled back down. Uhtred may not be there, in Winchester. But he had been. Thank heaven for monks sharing every scrap of information between monasteries that she had found that out in Caeligwylid. Someone would be there who knew of him. And she must find some sort of employment, for 2 pieces of silver would not last her long. But employment as what? She only knew fighting, being a warrior. It was what made her bold enough to sleep out of doors, even though there was still a great risk of being attacked if she remained on the tramp, because sleeping alone was dangerous. The most rewarding would to be accepted as a palace guard. She liked to fight because she was good at it. And, being at the palace meant more chance of hearing about her brother. Sunlight shone near the lee of trees in which she was sleeping and Osrith opened her eyes. The thought was now fixed in her mind, follow the river back down to Winchester and make inquiries about how she could work at the palace. A twig cracked beside her. Osrith got to her feet, feeling for Buey. No one seemed to be there. That meant nothing, of course. An attacker could hide in any number of places, as she had done herself many times. A Dane, perhaps. They probably roamed around here, sizing up the city. It would be a matter of time until they attempted a re-invasion, as they had done when Alfred had fled. And then, rain began. not just a few drops of springtime milk, but a great deluginal waterfall, washing past the lee of trees and down towards the river Richon. Osrith pulled her cloak around her, buoy in her hands, vertically in front of her. It would be slippery underfoot, so time would be an advantage. And lunged. Around the tree, wherever her attacker would be, he would be at the very least, surprised by the assault. At the very most, dead. But it was Osrith who was taken by surprise, as she stepped out of the shelter of the tree. A scrambling and whining met her. A she-wolf, small, and young, scrabbled back from her. Osrith lowered buoy. It was clear the animal was not going to harm her, and she wondered whether she had been sleeping in the wolf's sleeping place. More so, the she-wolf was clearly pregnant. Osrith turned back, pulling her cloak around her. No more sleeping out of doors if she could help it, she told herself, and strode off towards the capital of Wessex. The silver was to be gone by midday, Osrith knew, when she got to a slightly less sodden Winchester. She had clearly not been looking after her blade as she should have, and the edge was blunt. Ahead of her, thankfully, was the beginning of the commercial row, where trade and gossip flowed freely. People were crowded along it, as they were every day that Osrith had been there. The Two Cranes Inn was nearer the other end. Turning off halfway along it and she would reach the palace. But she had to have buoy made good, or she would have no blade at all within a month. A blacksmith's stood not far from the inn, and its thatched roof provided welcome relief from the incessant downpour and its forge warmth. Osrith unsheathed buoy as the blacksmith looked at her through deep-set eyes set within his large, red-burnished face. "My sword," Osrith said. "Sword," she repeated, taking out the blade. "It's rough, here." The man flicked his eyes to Osrith. He could not understand her properly, she could tell, but he did not flinch as the point of buoy moved in his direction. He looked at it, and then at Osrith, then lowered the point. "I have silver." Osrith offered the 2 coins to the man in her other hand. He understood that, and took Osrith's last 2 coins, carried with care from Alba and, before that, Sir Brit, who had bundled it into a boat, which Osrith, as Edra, had stolen to Fleebebenberg, and put them beside the forge. "I can recast her," he said, looking over the blade. "I can put an edge back onto her." "And do I?" Osrith asked, then in English, "Today?" "Today," nodded the blacksmith. So Osrith yielded buoy to the craftsman's fingers and watched as a link to her life in her immediate past was manipulated and mauled, bent and burnished, fire heating and water dousing the heat, as the fire also began to dry out her clothes. And, at length, the blacksmith paused. "Here," he said, pointing to the join of metal near the top of buoy's blade. And Osrith could see what the man meant, the blade had been badly cast. "I have no more silver," she said, then added, "No silver." The blacksmith frowned, as being him steam from the dousing sink mingled with the roar of the pouring rain outside. "A Briton?" he asked, frowning. Osrith paused, wondering about the answer. She could never say she was of Northumbria, and her accent betrayed she was no Saxon. Were Britons well received in Wessex? "Gaelish," Osrith replied, the safest thing she could think of. Too far away to really be a threat, if the blacksmith had ever heard of Gaelish people at all. But he must have heard something, for he broke into a smile. "My mother," the blacksmith confided, "was of Wales. The Gaels are of the same people, are they not?" He smiled encouragingly at Osrith, and she nodded. The blacksmith then looked back to buoy, taking her up again. When she tried to protest, for she had no more silver, he placed 2 bronze coins into her hand. "Done," he said, a few minutes later. In the same way Osrith had proffered her sword, the blacksmith offered it to her, blade first, so she could receive the handle. Buoy looked incredible. Her blade was straighter than when she had acquired her. In Tara, at the fighting contest, her shaft was no longer dull but shined like the moon. And, when she swung her before the blacksmith, she moved cleaner, and quicker. "I see you at the alehouse," the blacksmith told her. Osrith strained to understand. "At the inn, you," the man reshaped his sentence. Osrith nodded. "And you fight?" "I wish to be at the palace. Palace guard?" she asked. But the blacksmith shook his head. They have all the men they need. But, King Alfred's army always needs a few men. He glanced at Osrith's scabbard as Osrith thought, army? That was always a possibility. And, I hope it pays well. Here, the blacksmith said, offering Osrith a piece of fleece. To keep the blade oiled, he added. Osrith nodded. She had lost the last piece she had hid back at the palace, at Dunnottar, which Osrith still caught herself thinking of as home, and Buay, not only not being the best-kept sword when she first acquired her, had only got worse. My thanks, Osrith said, looking out at the now only spitting rain. It turned out that the palace was indeed looking for warriors for their army, for she had spoken to one of the sentries on guard at the hugely impressive stone building which was the capital city of the last independent kingdom of England. But the captain of the King's Guard would not be seeing anyone until the next day. The Palace of Wessex. It was more impressive than she could have thought. Dunnottar was not much than half its size, and was more enclosed, guarding itself with its own walls, whereas King Alfred's palace was contained within its own citadel, like Caerligwyd, with a boundary wall, guarded in all four directions by household guards. They had both been Roman cities, Osrith knew, so perhaps that was why they were similar, and similar to the Roman wall that divided England from Alba, which Domnall had expressed was his grandfather's desire to use as his own boundary, taking all of the land up to it as a part of his lands. And that suited Osrith, for displacing her uncle would be exactly what he deserved. And then, the reason she was in Wessex crystallized in Osrith's mind. She was here to find her brother, who was similarly treated by Elfric. Was that the only reason she was here? But then, as she approached the two cranes, she thought, he is family, she was Utad's sister, he was her brother. That had to count for something. With a refurbished sword but only 2 pennies, Osrith picked her way through the inn. She could now buy food, and she stood near the bar waiting to be served, but would not a room. Perhaps the she-wolf would not mind company until she could report to the palace in the morning to seek employment. For a damp afternoon, the inn was bereft of its usual number of customers. As she stood waiting in their moist straw-covering earth, a boy of about 8 came in through the back door of the inn, grinning at her. "Food?" he asked. "I'll get Mama." He had gone before Osrith could protest, because Mama was a young woman who worked at the inn in many capacities, and had encouraged Osrith to use her silver to pay for a room. And the rain had begun again, so when the boy's mother Elfber appeared with meat and bread, she twinkled at Osrith. "Won't be too much trouble to make up a bed," she encouraged. But Osrith shook her head. "I have enough money only for food," she said. Definitely, remembering the young woman's insistence, she spent some of her silver with her, horizontally. Like half, Elfber assumed she was a man. Osrith glanced at the rain, its rate accelerating, and she did wish she could, rather than fight the she-wolf for shelter. The girl left her alone with one backwards glance, Osrith noticed, and gripped Buay's handle, before eyeing the meal. She couldn't blame her. Whatever had led Elfber to prostitution could so easily have been her fate, with Svenkjutansson, if her uncle Elfric had his wish. She had just been chattel, but Osrith knew she could fight, and that had saved her from the Danes, at least. And, were she to find her brother, she would not give her life over to him, for him to decide. She must make decisions carefully. She must, if and when she found him. More men trickled into the inn as Osrith but into the meat and bread, Elfber keeping an eye on her, she noticed. Even if she was a man and did want to hump her, Osrith couldn't have paid her in any case, and when the girl brought some ale through to her, Osrith beckoned to her. "I cannot pay for this, I cannot pay for a bed," she said. The girl nodded, lowering her head to Osrith. "Have it anyway. You have been overcharged by my stepfather too many nights, and a bed for the night." But Osrith shook her head. It was too easy to fall into debt and have people chase her. She had seen a man being beaten until he couldn't stand a week ago in one of the back streets near Winchester's main commercial thoroughfare. She would find a sheltered spot for the night and try the next morning to gain a position at the palace. "Come back later?" Elfber asked, dipping her head close to Osrith's ear. She didn't turn. It was clear Elfber was trying to garner custom. Later I will still have no money, Osrith pointed out. But she didn't move her head, and when Osrith turned, the girl's lips met her cheek. No, Osrith said firmly, pulling away and placing the copper coins into her hand. My thanks for the good food, and your honesty. An hour later, opening the door onto a damp street smelling of animals, Osrith headed towards the woods again, beyond the city's walls, but found that the west gate and the south had been barred. No one in or out tonight, a guard called down to her. King's orders. Did that mean the king thought the city was going to be attacked? She really did not have anywhere to go now, Osrith thought. She had turned down a possible genuine offer of a bed, and could not sleep outdoors in shelter beyond the city. Guards were on duty by day and night, so most people were moved on, or arrested, and while she did want to get into the palace, being on the wrong side was not what she meant. It was getting dark now, the spring day bringing a chilly night to it. Osrith did not know Winchester well. Was there a bridge where archers could offer shelter? She knew where the Britons lived, in the north, at Crapelgate, but they always wanted paying for anything, and generously. East. She hadn't tried east, towards the downlands. Maybe something was there and her luck would turn. The stars were well risen by the time Osrith reached the east gate. Again, as with the west and south gates, it too was barred, and nothing but houses and hovels, guarded by blade or dog. Osrith turned. Maybe she had been too proud to have turned down the offer of the bed at the Two Cranes. Maybe Elfber's offer was genuine. If she returned, maybe she could sleep there after all. An unmistakable sound of a sword swooshing from a lined scabbard made Osrith turn. In the darkness there was little to see, but a crunch to her left drew her right. She held Buet close to her face, waiting. Then there was nothing. Osrith felt her heart thumping behind her bindings. And still she waited, just in case. So, as the moon began to rise, Osrith trod carefully along the road that took her back to the tradespeople in the centre of Winchester. The moon, at least, was casting a shadow along the dirt path. Many candles were lit now and she could navigate back to the kneeling cross. And then it came, an attack from behind her. As Osrith had turned to walk up the hill towards the Two Cranes, the lunge came. It was the man's step she heard first, the heavy thump to the left that suggested there was going to be a jab to the right. Hand on Buet, Osrith thrust out, the blade feeling foreign in her hand as its renewal by the blacksmith's hand had shifted its center of balance. She stumbled, and would have been beaten had not the assailant been aiming his blow towards another figure, now crumpled in a heap by his feet. Osrith gripped Buet again, forcing the attacker away from the stricken form who, by the look of it, was a man, waving his arms about, trying to fend off the blow. She struck, stabbing the assailant in the arm. He dropped his own blade and ran. Before offering the victim her arm, Osrith looked around her. Were there more attackers? And why this man? It took mere minutes to discover, as she helped the man to his feet, that he was Lord Odder, of Devonshire, who rewarded Osrith with a position in his guard. You'll grow, the Lord said the next day, when Miral, the head of his household guard, had been summoned to his large house within reach of the palace and had looked scornfully up and down Osrith's frame. And, I am most grateful for saving this old man's life. He laughed at that, his guards laughing too. For he has not yet given up fighting beside Alfred, Miral the mercen guard muttered after Lord Odder had left. Take pity, he has no son now, Elfrith, Odder's best swordsman lamented. And now we are off to Examswister, a third guard complained. Just when I have been enjoying the palace maids. So, that was how Osrith entered the service of Odder and found herself, a week later at his country estate guarding a woman, his goddaughter, by the name of Mildrith, and that he had no son because of Odder the Younger's treachery to Alfred.